Afternoon. I'm Dale Green, and I'm the Dean of the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. I want to welcome everyone to today's seminar, Beyond the Birds, Avian Influenza and Its Larger Effects. While the Warnell School is the lead sponsor, we're delighted to have some co-sponsors with other units on campus, including the College of Veterinary Medicine, the Odom School of Ecology, the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, and the College of Public Health. So thank our partners for their part as well. This special seminar will examine a major disease that's spreading globally among wild and domestic flocks of birds and also among other creatures. This poses a significant risk to our wild environments, our food security, and our public health. We have two very qualified people to discuss this issue with us today, and let me briefly introduce each of them. Dr. Karen Waldrop received her PhD in wildlife biology from Clemson University and both her MS and BS in wildlife concentrations from the University of Georgia here in the Warnell School. Karen currently serves as the Chief Conservation Officer for Ducks Unlimited and operates as a strategic leader and member of DU's executive leadership team. As Chief Conservation Officer, Karen leads Ducks Unlimited's national and international conservation programs, including science, sustainability, and habitat conservation operations, and the work of 4 regional offices focused on conservation delivery. Prior to joining DU, Karen served as the Deputy Commissioner for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. She also has years of professional experience with waterfowl and migratory bird conservation. She currently serves on the North American Wetlands Conservation Council, the advisory boards, both here in the Warnell School, our Dean's Advisory Board, the Wetlands America Trust Board, and the National Conservation Leadership Institute Board of Directors. Joining her is David Stallknecht, who's an emeritus professor in the Department of Population Health in the College of Veterinary Medicine here at the University of Georgia, and is a former director of the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study, fondly known as SQUIDUS among us here on campus. He's been with them for over 40 years. He received his PhD in epidemiology and community health from LSU and his MS in wildlife biology from the Warnell School here at UGA. His research interests continue to focus on the epidemiology of wildlife diseases that directly affect wildlife or indirectly affect domestic animal or public health. A bit about SQUIDUS, if you've never heard of it, it was founded in 1957 as a cooperative to provide wildlife disease expertise, diagnostic capacity, and research infrastructure to state wildlife agencies in the Southeast. This state-federal cooperative structure is a cost-efficient means of providing high-quality wildlife disease expertise to state and federal agencies without duplicating resources. And it's quietly been doing stellar work here on South Campus for decades. SQUIDUS recently has been a leader in regional and national efforts to track the spread of the current strain of avian influenza and monitor the species that are most seriously impacted. Clearly, we have 2 people with outstanding qualifications and firsthand experience here today to discuss this topic and its potential impacts. So Karen and David will deliver this jointly, so please help me welcome them as they come forward.
So it's very exciting to be back here. It's been quite a few years. I did come through with my son, who's a college student now, come back and kind of took him along. And of course, my first shock was that there's not a street that goes, the north-south bus doesn't run back out in front here in front of the school. So that was my first thing that I had to get used to. But I took him down to the creamery and took him to the lab here where I used to hang out with all my friends and students. But really loved my time at UGA, and I'm really excited to be back to be able to be part of this and to be able to help out the Warnell School of Forest Resources by helping out the dean on the advisory board as well. So it's wonderful to get reconnected and to be here with all of you today to see some new faces, meet some new people, and also to see some old friends. So as I get started on my part of it, Dr. Stallknecht is the expert as far as HPAI. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus a little bit, give you a little bit of background on Ducks Unlimited and who we are and what we do, and then kind of talk about how and why Ducks Unlimited got involved in this outbreak that occurred last year in 2022, and then some of the overall population effects. And I'll start on that side of it and leave the really hard stuff to Dave to talk about. So Ducks Unlimited, for those of you that maybe are not as familiar with the organization. So we're a conservation organization. This is our mission statement up here. We conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and associated habitats for North America's waterfowl. But what we do also benefits people and other wildlife as well. And we have some documents that are kind of our guiding documents. And one of them is the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. And then an internal document, our International Conservation Plan. And these two documents together, the NAWAMP, we call it, right? It's like SQUIDUS. Everyone in sciences love acronyms. So that document is actually a document that's put together every several years. It's updated, and it uses federal, state, nonprofit partners and others to help determine what are those important areas for waterfowl, as far as places that we need to focus our priority areas in our landscapes. All right, so how do we work? We're a turnkey organization, and what that means is we have biologists and engineers. I probably have almost as many engineers on staff as I do biologists. And we have these bioengineering teams that they take projects from conception all the way through to completion. And we work with multiple partners along the way. Here we work with Georgia DNR on a regular basis to work on different habitat projects. We work with federal partners, state partners, and then also private landowners. We work on securing funds, design and permitting, all the way through to construction management to get these projects done on the ground. And then where do we work? Again, what I mentioned as far as the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and then our International Conservation Plan, that's a DU document. We look at these landscapes in priority areas, either in breeding landscapes, migration, or in wintering landscapes. And this is actually one of my favorite slides to get to show, but it shows the reason why we work throughout North America. We work with DU Canada and DU Mexico. We're really one big organization, but we have 3 different sub-organizations just because of jurisdictional differences. And you can see here, waterfowl don't know any boundaries. So it's important that we manage the wetlands work that we do from an international and continental landscape. And this is the annual migration of pintails, right? So taking you all the way from their breeding grounds through migration all the way in the wintering grounds. And you can see they use a lot of those landscape priority areas. And these efforts have been successful for Ducks Unlimited. You know, years of science and following the science and the data, we've been able to conserve over 15 million. Actually, we're probably now at like about 17 million acres conserved across North America, working with our state, federal partners, and private landowners as well. So waterfowl has always been our true north, right? That's what we've always followed as far as what's important to us. But what we have received a lot of support in recent years because of all the benefits that wetlands provide people. And these are called ecosystem services. So an ecosystem service is simply something that how people benefit from healthy ecosystems. And in this case with wetlands, some of those include clean water, flood attenuation, water recharge, other wildlife and recreational benefits are all things that are associated with that. And so we're gaining a lot of support that way as well. And it's also benefiting waterfowl at the same time. Okay, so now that with a little bit of background on DU and our mission, let's transition to the topic of highly pathogenic avian influenza. And first, I guess what's important about this is to first talk about how waterfowl resource is managed in North America and what our efforts are associated with that. So the most important thing to clarify is that waterfowl are a federally managed resource, and principally because of what I just talked about as far as their migration over jurisdictional boundaries. And we have 4 flyways in North America: the Pacific, the Central, Mississippi, and then Georgia sits in the Atlantic flyway. And it's a federally managed resource. However, from harvest standpoints, it's both state and federal. It's a shared job between state and federal. Ducks Unlimited doesn't have anything to do with setting harvest restrictions. That's again, all state and federal jurisdiction. We do participate in the flyway meetings that occur. We have staff on technical committees and everything else, but it's important to note that harvest is, again, first federally managed, and then harvest is through state and federal partners. And this is, so now talking about the disease a little bit more, okay? This is a pie chart showing 2022. Now, in a lot of years, blue and orange, and it might be hard to see from back there, blue and orange is all HPAI, mortality. And this is just the Mississippi flyway of waterfowl mortality in North America, in the Mississippi flyway. And in most years, all of these other trauma, diseases, everything would take up that entire pie chart. But 2022, with this large outbreak that we had, it was well over half of the events and mortality was caused by HPAI, which is very unusual to see. And then a little bit of background on avian influenza. So it's in the family of influenza A viruses, and that's the one that, you know, we come into contact with every year. And again, I'm gonna let Dave go into a little bit of the background, but just to understand the general overview of what's happening with HPAI. Waterfowl, of course, and other birds can be a huge transmission source for HPAI on an annual basis. And again, this is, well, actually, I'm going to go into modes of transmission first. So infected birds, why waterfowl are so susceptible of having the disease and showing signs of the disease in this last year is because infected birds shed through feces and oropharyngeal fluids. And this is the fecal oral routes, the primary mode of transmission, which shouldn't be surprising. So waterfowl will oftentimes feed in the same places where they excrete. So, and they oftentimes it's just shallow areas. And so this transmission and being able to pass this on to other birds, individuals, it's a very effective mode of transmission that you can see. It's a primary mode. So it's no big surprise. And then other birds like raptors and vultures that become infected, that's mostly because of, or thought to be because they are feeding on, scavenging on dying or dead waterfowl. So the viral subtypes. So within the world of avian influenza, there's numerous subtypes, but that's the most prominent way of classifying them is either high path or low pathogenic. And the classification is a reflection of the degree to which the virus causes disease in domestic chickens. And most AI viruses are low path, but and cause minor disease in flocks and in poultry. But high path can cause almost nearly 100% mortality in domestic flocks and domestic chickens, poultry can cause almost 100%. We haven't seen a lot of mortality and disease in waterfowl and wild birds until the mid 90s. I think was one of the 95, 96 were one of the first years where we actually saw a lot of HPAI and regularity in wild birds. But then this past year, so again, remember, what would happen with poultry is if HPAI was mostly in poultry facilities, they could depopulate pretty quickly and keep it maintained. But that all kind of changed with 2022 as far as in wild birds and the detection and the mortality as well. And you can see here, HPAI was detected in 125 different wild birds in 2022, and ducks and geese accounted for 50 to 70% of all detections across the flyways. And again, the raptors and vultures, you can see here in the blue part of the section, they were hit pretty hard. Again, mostly thought to be because of scavenging on sick or dead birds. And this is interesting. So again, this is wild birds detection as far as throughout North America. And we know that this is just a small fraction of the birds this is just what's reported, but we know this was just a small fraction. A lot weren't reported. We know firsthand from lots of calls and everything in Louisiana and Arkansas, as far as the number of birds that people saw dying, that many of those went unreported. And so we will never know what that real number probably is. But as far as in commercial flocks, our partners, federal partners, have a very good understanding of what that mortality is. And you can see it was 47 affected states and almost 59 million birds. So it was a huge hit to the poultry industry in 2022. All right, so a little bit, you know that we don't have Ducks Unlimited. How and why did we become involved? We don't have any jurisdictional oversight as far as the harvest restrictions or anything like that. We don't have the expertise from the disease standpoint or the authority. So why and how did we become involved? Well, The why is pretty easy. We have over 700,000 supporters, and a lot of those are waterfowl hunters. And then on top of that, many of them hunt and own dogs. And so it was really important. We knew that these were people that were going to be coming in contact with these sick birds throughout the season. So early on, we decided it was really important that we just communicate with them. And a lot of our landowners are on the front lines as well. They have people that are coming on there and hunting. Of course, they're seeing these birds throughout the year as well. So it was important that we kept them informed. So we did it from an information standpoint. In the summer, we said, okay, we had heard about that HPAI was becoming more prevalent. So we created a web page that was dedicated to avian flu, and we worked with our partners in Canada and Mexico to try to spread the word, tell hunters what avian flu is, how severe is it, precautions that they can take to help not, contracting or causing any further movement of the disease. But then our participation really ramped up somewhat unexpectedly when USDA APHIS put a ban just right before waterfowl season was starting. They put a ban on any birds coming in, harvested birds coming in from Canada to the US. So all the hunters that were going up to hunt in Canada were not going to be able to bring back any of their harvested birds. So our phone started lighting up. People started sending us emails, text messages, and saying, hey, can you help? So we reached out to APHIS, and we talked to their personnel and their leadership, and we started having a conversation about risk, relative risk. And actually, Dr. Stallknecht and SCWDS provided us with a lot of very important data that we were able to use to then go back to APHIS to talk about that risk. So when you're talking about hunters that are going to be bringing back harvested birds versus millions of birds that were about to be migrating across Canada into the US, let's talk about the relative risk of these two things and the issues that these bring. But it was still what they had to focus on was, okay, these birds are coming in and they were responsible for that transport of those birds. So we were able to use the data that SCWDS provided us and come up with a solution that they felt was reasonable and we felt was reasonable. And so getting rid of the parts of the bird that have the highest modes of transmission, like the organs and feathers and things like that. That way the hunters could still bring back their birds and they were able to somewhat mitigate. But we also promised in all of that discussion that we would also continue to use this information and put this out to help educate people and let folks know what's going on and how they can help mitigate any risk of transmission as well. And so it became a really good partnership that we continue actually today. And here's what we heard from hunters. So so that was that part. So that was lifted. We pushed out all this information that APHIS had. And then the next thing happened was in November, when the seasons was starting up in Arkansas and in the southern states, we started getting text messages and calls of people seeing all of these sick and dying birds all across the landscape. And so then our next major engagement became, and snow geese, by the way, was probably one of the greatest that we saw. And if you'll remember last year during that time, late fall, it was really dry. So what was happening is all the snow geese were congregating. It further exacerbated the problems. They were congregating in whatever habitat was left. And so that transmission that I was talking about before, so you've got all these birds in really shallow water all together. And they were seeing, hundreds of birds in just one place. And so we realized, and here's just a quick video if it'll play for us. Nope. Well, that's okay. So what this is, if I can maybe use it this way with the mouse, is a hunter deciding that, it's not going to work. Oh, wait, here we go. Saw a sick. Nope, that's okay. Anyway, just take my word for it. He goes down and tries to pet it, right? So he's sitting there looking at this dying bird, and he's going down there trying to pet it and pick it up. And so it was obvious that we needed to continue communicating to our hunters of what to do if they come in contact with a sick or dying a bird of any sort. And then further communications with Jim Ronquest. He's a prominent waterfowl person, has an Instagram live, invited us to come on and talk about the issue as well. Received a lot of views that way. We realized that communication was the best way that Ducks Unlimited could help. We had several podcasts too that Dr. Stallknecht joined us for, and we had lots of different experts on there as well to talk about HPAI, the what it is and how it's spread and what hunters can do and what they can do with their part. So what were the effects on wild waterfowl? This is really important to look at the difference between detection and mortality. So from a detection standpoint, we saw the most in ducks, and that's going to be your second slot, your second column there. And the blue bars are mortality. So anything blue, that shows the mortality. And waterfowl was highly detected, but that was likely behind the increased importance around waterfowl and waterfowl hunters and everything along those lines. But then mortality was the greatest in geese, and specifically snow geese, Rosses, and Canada geese were the most, the highest mortality factors. And then raptors, again, bald eagles, great horned owls, and red-tailed hawks were extremely impacted. You have to remember that waterfowl and raptors, we saw a lot of this in juveniles just because, which is what you would expect, because those are naive to the virus at all. Again, in chickens, when they get it, they're all naive to it. So you have a lot of almost 100% mortality. For the most part, you don't typically see that as much in waterfowl. We did have some heavy hit areas. In fact, common eiders up in St. Louis, one really well-known population had 5 to 15% mortality. And it was so bad that a lot of the Northeastern states asked hunters not to harvest juveniles and females. It was all, of course, all voluntary, but they did ask them not to harvest any of those. And that was up in Atlantic Canada. And then another population was Pacific black brant in Alaska. Several populations were pretty hard hit. Don't know the full extent of it, but nobody's really expecting any population level impacts because of this. But it's still, a lot of that is still unknown. So there are definitely some populations of waterfowl that were hit hard. But how is this going to impact DU's priority areas? Probably not very much. Those same landscapes that were important to waterfowl prior to HPAI are still important afterwards. But we stand ready to, work with our state and federal partners if there are certain ways that we learn that we might be able to help to mitigate the impacts of HPAI in the future. We stand ready to help with that, of course, but our priorities will stay the same before and after HPAI. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stallknecht to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the disease. And he will wow you with some of that, I know you will. But I really appreciate being here and look forward to talking with some of you again later.
My slides aren't as pretty as yours. And I'm a little freaked out right now. In 1970, I took my first wildlife biology course in this room. So it's just, it's a little strange. It looks a lot nicer now than it did back then. I'm going to just really concentrate on really two questions related to high pathogenic avian influenza virus in wild birds. Will this represent a significant wildlife disease? Karen already mentioned that there's a lot of mortality, it's a lot of infection, but we need to kind of piece it together and see what really effects this will have in the long term, if any. And then more equally importantly, beyond the birds, how does this relate to domestic animal and public health risk? Because they're there and they always have been there. So one thing about influenza, it fits really well into sort of a One Health framework because it affects everything. And if we actually look at influenza, it's obviously a very important human disease. And really all the flu viruses that we see every year originated on the way back from wild bird reservoirs. That's where they came from. And it's the same with the viruses that affect pigs and the same with the viruses that affect chickens. They all have a history of coming from basically waterfowl and other wild bird populations. So they're important for human health. They're very important for animal health. And as Karen said, they really were not a big issue with wild birds as far as mortality and that sort of population effects prior to the emergence of the goose guandong virus in 1996. And things have very much changed. And in these different silos, we actually look at outcomes and look at what we're going to do about flu in very different ways. In human health, it's really all about developing improved vaccines and therapeutics. We know we're going to get flu. Let's be prepared. Let's treat. With animal health, it's a really different thing. It's a combination of vaccines. That's what they use in swine. but it's actually depopulation when it gets in chickens. They just eradicate it when these viruses get into poultry populations. In ducks, we're kind of stuck. We don't really have a lot of options in how to control or eradicate this thing, probably none at this point. But we're trying to learn how to live with it and trying to learn if we really do have to react to it. What are the impacts? What is really the problem? Just basically problem definition. And I want to just add just one thing here. High path is new, but flu research is not, especially in wild birds. This dates back to really the 1950s. We got a really long and rich scientific basis of low path influenza in wild birds. And this has come from a lot of basic studies, and often very poorly funded basic studies where people have just pulled it together. And what's really nice about this, we have some really long-term data sets, even dating back to the 1970s, where we can look at patterns and look at systems and understand how these viruses at least used to operate in these wild bird populations. So will this represent a significant wildlife disease? And I put this timeline in. This is from a publication we did with Andy Ramey in the Alaska Science Center. And it's really interesting. In 1961, the first influenza virus was isolated from a wild bird. And it was a highly pathogenic influenza virus, swift turns in Africa, in South Africa. And that was the first and last high path influenza virus ever isolated from a wild bird until the goose guandong came through later. So while they were a reservoir for influenza viruses, historically, they were not a reservoir for high pathogenic influenza viruses. They evolved in poultry populations once the spillover occurred. And that is exactly what happened here. The first high path goose guandong virus was in 1996 from a goose associated with a highly pathogenic influenza outbreak in China. It stayed in poultry for those years. In 2002, we were informed that we had highly pathogenic influenza killing wild birds in China. It was in a park, it was in some wild ducks, it was in the zoological collection. And this was the first report of that since 1961. So it was something really new. No one knew what was going to come of that, whether it's going to go away, whether it's going to persist, but did it persist? And every year since then, through a series of exchanges between infected domestic flocks and wild birds, it adapted and adapted and adapted to wild bird populations and became a virus that is fully capable of not only persisting in wild avian reservoirs, but also causing mortality, which is somewhat atypical. These outbreaks in wild birds from about 2002 to about 2015 were sporadic. You'd see an outbreak in geese somewhere, go away. Wouldn't be there the next year pop up somewhere else. No one knew where it was coming. And the specific lineages in these outbreaks sort of died out. But then in I think it was 2010, a lineage clade 2344 goose guandong came to pass. And we have had trouble with this virus ever since. And we got actually some good indication that this was going to be an issue in North America from the Europeans. They've had annual outbreaks in Europe every year. And we also had a little glimpse of this in 2014, 2015, where it came across the Bering Strait, infected birds in North America, probably about 100, and then subsequently disappeared. It didn't make it in the North American ecosystem. This latest one seems to be just making it fine. But from the messages we got from Europe, it affects primarily waterfowl, is most of the infections. There's some species trends, as in North America, geese, a lot of mortality in geese, a lot of sporadic outbreaks, big outbreaks in geese. Reported species reflect different transmission pathogens, and that it relates to the raptors and scavengers. Low path does not kill birds, so it does not spill over into the scavengers and the raptors. High path does. So it's actually a new transmission system. And then limited mortality estimates. And this is a problem that still exists today. We have a long list of dead birds and numbers of dead birds, but it's hard to put those into perspective. when you don't know the population, you don't know the specifics, and you do not even know the sensitivity of your detection, whether you're counting all of them, half of them, or 1% of them. Okay, will this represent a significant wildlife disease? One thing we're interested in is certainly population effects. That's how we actually measure impacts in wildlife. And avian mortality is really difficult to quantify. They're hard to find. Dead birds are out there, but they're difficult to find, and denominators are difficult to estimate in a lot of cases. What we see and what is hidden, and Karen mentioned this is extremely important to keep in mind, that infection does not equal disease. Some birds are infected, they do fine, they're subclinical, you'll see nothing, and some die. And this relationship may change seasonally. You may see juveniles dying at a certain time of the year and not because of building population immunity and that sort of thing. Our potential problems species specific, and impacts will probably be very species dependent. And we're seeing that right now. And I'm going to go after this slide into some examples of what we're seeing in North America and how we're kind of trying to address it. And all these are works in progress. How may this affect the population? And there's a lot of different outcomes here. Maybe catastrophic. You may see huge outbreaks in geese. And a good example of a potentially catastrophic event. This weekend, we got notification that 3 California condors died in Arizona. They could be erosive, where it affects just the recruitment in the population, and it affects juveniles. And they could be sporadic, or we could see them every year. We don't know. And then finally, is the risk of mortality or population effects predictable? We want to get ahead of this thing. We want to understand what might happen, give some early warning, and understand where these population impacts may be going. So let's start with mallards and other ducks, and don't try to read any of this. This is just sort of a flow chart. This is some work that we're doing in the Mississippi flyway. And this is a good example of a species, or mainly blue-winged teal, where you see high infection rates, but very, very little mortality. And this is pretty much characteristic of most duck species in North America. But long story short, this is a species that'll be probably really important spill over to poultry, if you're looking at infection rates, and potentially public health, if there's ever a situation where these things are being transmissible to humans. But the infection rates that we're seeing with this virus are extraordinary. They're unprecedented. We were doing some work in Minnesota, and this is during the spring. This is usually when peak infection prevalence occurs in ducks. It's usually around 40 or 50% with all the influenza viruses combined. With high path alone, it was 63%. In mallards, it was 82%. So if you're a wildlife biologist out there banding ducks, you are seeing and coming in contact with a lot of influenza virus. What's interesting, typically in waterfowl, what we see is a clear seasonal pattern with infection peaking in August and September, associated with those naive juveniles coming on the pre-migration grouping when they group up there, and staging. I think the word right. And then it dwindles as population immunity grows, prevalence goes down in the wintertime. It's almost non-existent in the spring and hard to find at all. I mean, really hard to find during the breeding season. And also subtypes, different subtypes kind of change throughout the year. And what's interesting is that is exactly what we're seeing with high path. It seems to be following the same epidemiological, direction as we see with low path, with a high prevalence in late summer, falling on the wintering grounds. Becky, right there in the audience, is testing blue-winged teal. We're working in Louisiana right now, and we've yet to find a virus, which is pretty cool. So it may be predictable when we need to think about risk from ducks. And it's, again, getting back to the backbone of this and the basic research that we kind of base this on. We're working in the Mississippi flyway, and Mississippi flyway is probably, as far as influenza go, is the best studied flyway best studied system in the world. And we recently worked with St. Jude Children's Hospital in Ohio State, kind of put together a retrospective analysis of what's been done in there since 1976. And we actually had 8,000 individual viruses to kind of go through from 77,000 birds. So it was a very rich data set, and it really provides a roadmap. But seasonality appears to follow the same trends as low pathogenic, driven by population immunity, and can predict when prevalence in waterfowl may be highest. So there are some good news things from this. This is something that I think is interesting. I threw this in for any ecologists that might be in the audience because I think this is interesting. This came from a study in Tennessee where they're actually banding birds at the time, putting transmitters on them, mortality estimates, and actually finding, looking at survival. And we just happened to sample these birds for flu at the same time. And we just happened to run right in the middle of a major outbreak in this birds at the same time. This occurred in January in Tennessee in the Mississippi Flyway, and this was last year. So it was first detected in North America in December, and this was in January. So it was already in the Mississippi Flyway. It was a lot more spread out in North America than anyone really knew. But it's a perfect example of a mini SIR kind of thing, where basically the population was susceptible to start with. They were infected, and then we start seeing seroconversion. They're resistant, and none of these birds were even affected. Even the infected ones, they had the radio transmitter on, and they were looking at movement. They were looking at everything. No effect whatsoever. But we kind of made sure that they understood that it's no effect at this time, because they did have a lot of previous immunity to low pathogenic viruses, and there's cross protection. So there may have been some protection there. What they didn't have is any immunity to H5 viruses, which would offer full protection. So we can actually monitor these things and sort of get a glimpse of what even an individual bird might be in relation to susceptibility. Snow geese have already been mentioned. Lots of mortality in snow geese. Unlike ducks, geese, you see a lot of mortality. And this is seen in Europe also. There are two large mortality events associated with highly pathogenic. The first one occurred in the spring when it first came here, and these were the birds migrating back to Canada to the breeding grounds. And the latest one came in the fall when the birds were coming down and on the wintering grounds. And one of the things we start inserting here is, okay, we have a list of a lot of dead birds. We're getting counts, and we're getting some idea of mortality, but let's figure out what's going on immunologically in these birds. So working with wildlife biologists, we're getting blood samples and we're testing them to kind of measure, to actually see if they're developing any herd immunity or any population immunity in this. And this is sort of how we handled it right now. We didn't have any pre-samples from these birds, pre-outbreak, but we had samples from previous years when the virus wasn't here. And this is the comparison. And actually, if you look at population immunity, just estimated population immunity to H5, in 2016, it was 19%. In 2023, after the outbreak, it was up to 62%. And most of the birds, 81%, had some immunity to at least one influenza virus. We basically looked at this and said, we probably won't see the spring outbreak this year. And so far, so good. So it seems to be, the prediction seems to be holding a little bit. But here's the bad news. And this is a very small sample size, again, work in progress. But if you actually look at the expected population immunity in immatures and adults, you'll see that the immatures are still at risk. So you can predict that if you're seeing mortality, it'll probably be a juvenile bird. You can also sort of guess that if you see mortality in the summer, it'll probably be those naive birds, just as in ducks. Now with geese, they seem to be affected later than ducks when they arrive on the wintering ground. So this may be a species where we see these outbreaks to a lesser extent, but we see them almost every year. Time will tell. We do a lot of work outside of ducks on red knots and other shorebirds. We love working with shorebirds. And again, working with St. Jude, we have a data set going back to 1985 every year. And we've been, shorebirds are a really interesting scenario. They're generally globally, you don't find a lot of viruses in shorebirds, but in the eastern United States, even in the Georgia coast, South Carolina coast, and at Delaware Bay, where most of the long-term stuff, you see some pretty high prevalence every year. It's usually could be up to sometimes up to 20% of the birds. But this is in the spring, during basically the spring migration to the wintering grounds, where they sort of gather and eat horseshoe crab eggs and gather in large groups. I just want to point one thing out with these birds. This is interesting. Angie Maxted did some work on this for her PhD here, where we're looking at difference in species. And ma'am, when you're working in wild birds, when I work with my colleagues in public health and I work with my colleagues in domestic animal health, there's only one species of wild birds in their eyes, and it's wild birds. But that is not the case. And you have to look at species traits and species behavior, because that in most cases is the driver of all of this. And if you look at three species here, red knots, sanderling, and ruddy turnstones at Delaware Bay, ruddy turnstones are the one most infected. If you do serology on these birds, you'll see that they have some herd immunity, but it's in the moderate level. So it explains that there are susceptibles out there and they're infected every year. We do occasionally get isolates from red knots, but very, very few. But red knots also arrive at Delaware Bay with almost a 100% population immunity to influenza viruses. So that explains that. And we'll move over to sanderlings. And these birds are head to head on the beach. They're right next to each other. So it's not a contact thing. With sanderlings, we hardly ever get an influenza virus out of a sanderling, and they are 100% naive. So if anyone can explain that, I'm open for suggestions, but it's fascinating. And what's interesting about that, of the three species, sanderling would be the most affected. And it is the one species that's showing up in mortality right now with high path influenza virus, not in large numbers, but it is in fact showing up. In Europe, they had a major outbreak in red knots. And people who know shorebirds know that we can't afford to lose a lot of shorebirds. They're species at risk. But it was shorebirds. We have not seen influenza on the East Coast in shorebirds, and this is fascinating, but we continue to look. This is one that needs to be monitored. Shorebirds consistently are infected with influenza virus, and subtypes change every year, unlike ducks. We see species-related variation. I just mentioned that. But what's interesting is these influenza viruses, if you do phylogenetics on the viruses, they originate from ducks. So if high path is in ducks, it has a probability of getting into shorebirds. So it's something we need to keep our eyes on. Okay, let's move over into raptors. And this is sort of an example of the different kinds of issues that you can run into, especially species-dependent issues. So this is some work we did actually with the Georgia DNR in the Georgia coast and in Florida with eagles, and they reported to us that they were seeing mortality, or actually they reported to us that they were seeing a decline in nesting success. And we had already had some isolates from bald eagles on the Georgia coast. Matter of fact, we had a situation where we found a dead adult that was positive and the nestlings that were positive, and it's all influenza virus. And what happened on there with eagles, especially nesting eagles, they are probably scavenging waterfowl that died. There was a big scalp outbreak on the Georgia coast, Florida coast during that year. And in the areas where we did see infected scalp, we also saw a marked decline in nesting success. And it was really a very, 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 very big decline, but it was very localized. Statewide, it didn't affect the population, but it was really a local effect. The thing that we don't know is this something that's going to occur every year? And we're monitoring that right now. And it may be a one-off. And if it's a one-off, we probably can live with it. But if it's not, we probably need to think about maybe doing something. Black vultures is another really crazy story. The first black vulture cases started in Florida and were detected in Florida. We started seeing these in Georgia. And what happened there, it seemed to be actually maintained in black vulture populations through a vulture feeds on a dead bird or something, gets infected, brings it back to the roost, drops dead, falls to the bottom of the roost, its friends eat them. And it just passed from vulture to vulture to vulture, and it's pretty much a self-sustaining thing. This thing has now been detected as far north as New York and as far west as Louisiana. And really large numbers of vultures, large proportions of roosts dying, okay? We don't know where this is going. We're not detecting it a lot now. So perhaps we're over it, perhaps we're not. But this is another place where we inserted some serology here, and we actually looked at two populations, one in Florida that had really survived one of these things, or at least they were alive after the outbreak, and one in Kentucky where they still haven't actually reported it. And what we see there is actually a really growing population immunity level, which is really good. And we've got it set up where this is actually population immunity specific to the high path virus. We're actually using that high path virus. It's actually a construct because it's low path, but we're using the antigen to actually measure this. So that's encouraging. So we see a lot of mortality. You don't know what the outcome is, but there's some population immunity building. So we're not thinking extinction here. Okay, this is something that again was reported from Europe, and this is sort of getting into the more public health arena. But what we're seeing in North America right now are spillover into wild mammals, which is atypical. And again, it's probably the scavenger situation where birds normally don't die from low path. They're not picked up by fox and things scavenging, but high path kills them and they're on the landscape and they're picked up. So this is some work that we actually are doing with St. Jude. And they just looking at the diversity here, and there's been enormous number of species affected by this, from cats to skunks to coyotes to bottlenose dolphins to seals. And it seems to be able to affect a lot of different species. But one of the more interesting things about this is these viruses also, it's a segmented genome, and they're reassorting with all the low path influenza viruses in North America. So we don't have one virus here. We have a whole suite of new viruses here. And when St. Jude was actually first looking at this, putting these viruses into their ferret model, Becky sent them two viruses. One of them killed 100% of the ferrets quicker than ever has been recorded with a ferret study. The others did nothing. And that one that did was a reassortant virus. And this has been replicated several times since then. So we got a lot of diversity out there that actually needs to be accounted for. There's no indication, we don't know where this is going. There's no indication that it's persisting in wild mammal populations. This is just spillover, but we're starting to do some serology and actually beefing up surveillance to take a look at this. So how does this relate to domestic animal and public health risk? Providing a clear perspective on risk, when and where are wild birds infected, what species, to provide them with a little situational awareness and a little fear that, you know, you better have some biosecurity because it's in your backyard. And providing the biological material to feed science related to domestic animal and public health. The genomes, those isolates we get, they go to basically USDA and NVSL as part of the national surveillance, and everyone else's in North America does too. So everybody is pretty conscientious about, you know, providing the viruses you need for research, providing the viruses you need for to analyze what's going on the outbreak, and it's quite a good situation. Epidemiological information, you know, what are the transmission networks? This is really a tough thing to do when you're looking at spillover from a wild bird to a domestic bird, because I don't know if any of you have flown in a low aircraft over Georgia and looked down to see how many poultry facilities are there. And even if you had 2 outbreaks in Georgia, it is such a small proportion of what's out there. And all of these are low probability events that probably all have a different story behind them. And these kind of things are really difficult to sort out. So they're maybe making some progress, but I don't think we'll fully ever say, okay, this is where it came from. This is the scenario that allowed this to go from a wild bird to a domestic flock. And also pathogenesis. The viruses that we get go right into chicken trials, turkey trials, when we actually look at pathogenesis, transmission, and all that sort of thing. So that's sort of where we fit in there. We're not part of the surveillance, but we contribute a lot to the surveillance. In public health, we go a different route. The material we get, we actually sent to St. Jude Children's Hospital. We are part of the St. Jude Center of Excellence. And there are other Sears networks, and they are tasked with risk assessment. So these viruses actually go into a ferret model to see transmission. They look at receptors, they look at all this stuff. They share with CDC to actually look at the human risk associated with it. And at present, that is, it's very, very low. They also get put in vaccine panels when they're testing that seasonal vaccine and everything else. So they're readily shared. So I think Karen covered this. So I'm going to just skip over this really, really quickly and just make a couple points. Really what we can do, and we've been fortunate to be allowed to share some of our messaging with DU. And this is the kind of relationship, I think, where you can get science out there in the field and where it's really needed. And you know, if you look at waterfowl and the number of infected birds that hunters are handling, I just actually cooked 6 blue-winged teal, and I was looking at my prevalence, and I was wondering if I should swab my cutting board. I didn't. But long story short, you need to get the word out. And there's simple things that you can do. You don't want to generate a lot of fear, but you can sure promote hand washing. You sure can promote not throwing your carcasses on the landscape or, you know, scavengers to get. And simple things. And I want to put a big shout out for wildlife biologists here also. They are the bread and butter of our work. Basically flu, in an experimental setting, you can probably infect every avian species in the world, but few avian species are actually involved in flu. And it is behavior that drives this. And no one knows that better than wildlife biologists and ornithologists. And they need to be actively involved in all of this work. And with that, I will quit talking. Thank you. Come on, Karen.
So we have time for some questions, and we have a couple of our ambassadors here with us with mics. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and they'll bring you a mic, and that'll get captured on the audio for the video that will be out shortly after this. Probably in a week or so, we'll have a recording out, edited and captioned and available online. So questions from the audience. There's one here down front. Y'all go ahead and stand up and be on that. Help me look for folks with hands up. Yes. Switch it on. There you go.
Thanks for 2 really excellent talks. When I look at this massive data set that we're gathering, I'm wondering now, if you think you're at a point where you can begin to model risk by looking at things like a combination of time of year, behavior, species, and then now that sequencing can occur so quickly, can you look at kind of hot spots in the combination and say, if you have 4 out of 5 of these elements in place, the risk is now you've gone to orange, orange risk.
That's exactly where I want to go. And the one thing that's the problem with flu is that there aren't enough lenses to kind of actually see what's going on. And that's why we're trying to do a lot of immunology and serology, where we actually may get some things we can measure and actually understand the mechanism behind what we're seeing. And I think if we get there, the modeling will just come. I think the more we actually can look at these, so we've only looked at this for a year, so there's no trends really, right? So we're going to have to continue to look at it. But again, leaning on what we know with flu, with the low path things really helps, because then we have a goal, is it following this pattern, which we know exists with low path? So I think that's where we are, but that's exactly where we need to go, where we can actually say, okay, here are the areas of risk, here's the time of risk. And, if you're a poultry producer, we don't want to let you off the hook. Your biosecurity needs to go every day of the year, because it's out there, even if it's in low prevalence, but at least we can give them some sort of relatively idea.
Good question.
We have a question from one of our viewers online. They were curious, going back to the slide about the study of the ferret and why the ferrets were used, and if there was a reason, maybe genetically, why they all died.
Okay, I can handle the first part of that. I can't explain why they died. I think influenza killed them. But long story short, ferrets are the animal model for human influenza. Okay, I mean, that's where the vaccine trials are done. That's where isolates are evaluated. And what it is a model for is transmissibility. And I should have said that on the slide, but the way it's set up, there's adjoining cages with a separation where you'll only get transmission through aerosol. So they have control ferrets in with them. So they do contact transmission and then look for aerosol transmission. The isolates we're doing right now have killed the ferrets, but transmission, no. And that's the good news, is that these viruses still have avian receptors. So transmission potential is really low. And actually infection potential is really low in people. But the ferret model is routinely used in influenza research.
Other questions?
I think it's also very low for dogs too,
Oh.
talking about people with that until last week.
Let me,
Yeah.
till last week. Yeah, so this is one slide I said, and all of this will change. Well, one of the things I said on there was there's no indication in dogs, and that changed last week. There was a report from Canada. It's probably, who knows, again, no perspective on it, right? But in actually working with University of Pennsylvania, one of our former employees up there, we are testing hunting dogs right now and getting a history from hunters. So we will have some idea. And we're doing this serologically just to see if there's a lot of exposure, but no disease, or no exposure and sort of odd disease sort of situation. But hunters, I mean, I love working with hunters. I mean, when we mentioned, I think one of our field biologists mentioned this to hunters, say, bleed my dog, test my ducks and bleed me. I'm willing to cooperate. So it's easy to work. Of course, you have to go through a lot of stuff at the university to do it, but that's okay.
Thank you. Other questions? Got one here.
So especially in snow geese, given that it does change behavior, it makes birds clinically ill. Is there any bias in winter-killed birds? Do you know if there's any increased prevalence in winter-killed birds over the general population?
I do not. But we're seeing we're seeing high prevalence in also the ones we rocket net and, getting swimming traps and that sort of thing too. And there's a bias associated with that too, because you're concentrating them. So it's hard to sort those things out. And the way we handle that is we actually compare hunter kill with hunter killed, rocket net it with rocket net it. So that bias is sort of a constant. That's the best we can do.
And most of the reports we were getting from hunters, they were not flying anyway. Most of them were on the ground swimming, but they weren't actually getting up and flying at that point. But
Those ones that are easy to shoot.
those are the easy ones, right? Not going anywhere.
You mentioned that when waterfowlers need in Canada, there's a higher prevalence, partially because they're all hanging out together and spreading. And I'm worried about unnatural concentrations down in the southeast too, you know where I'm from. So in our high infested place, we really attract a lot of waterfowl, but we might be holding them in a place where they'd be more likely to pass back. I had to throw it out there.
Okay, a little bit. We actually saw that a lot this past year. Again, it was so dry, so it was concentrating those birds even more than usual in a lot of the fields in Arkansas. We do a lot of with the rice farmers in Arkansas and Louisiana. And so what we were seeing was that high concentration, and people were saying they were seeing them literally falling out of the sky. And again, that mode of transmission, all that's doing is exacerbating and making that issue bigger and bigger. So, but from a scientific research standpoint, I'm not sure what you guys saw.
Yeah, there's no data to support it, but it hasn't been looked at. And that's another thing. I mean, there's a whole lot of management options that are done on waterfowl and green tree reservoirs, and there's a lot that actually we could look at in the long term.
And that's where Ducks Unlimited could, working with you guys as far as what kind of work that we're doing right now, how can we maybe alter some of that to help mitigate some of this